The greatest achievers in any sport or high-risk occupation are those that possess the confidence and desire to test their skills beyond the accepted boundaries. They live for the next challenge, setting goals and then attempting to reach them. The situations become critical as they go faster, further, and higher, continually pushing the limits. In the next half hour, the spirit of adventure, exploration, and competition will set the stage as you marvel at the skills, the courage, and the daring of the world's greatest extremists. Welcome to the Extremists. Today, we look at mountain biking's fastest rising star, downhill world champion Dave Cullinan. Then it's off to Europe to catch up with Lynn Hill, whose 17-year devotion to the sport of rock climbing has made her one of the world's best. And finally, we tour the four corners of Indonesia with renowned psychoanthropologist Dr. Lawrence Blair. Competitive mountain bike racing has emerged as one of the world's wildest and most exciting new sports spectaculars. Riders risk all as they literally fly down the daunting black diamond terrain of some of the country's most awesome ski mountains. Like skiing the giant slalom, the downhill and mountain biking is not only riveting to watch, but very scary to run.
The greatest challenge to this race is probably continually cheating death on a regular basis.
Consider what professional riders face each time they rocket down the hill.
Traveling around 55 miles an hour, anything can happen. The wind comes up, you're tucked down, your eyes are blurred back in their sockets, and it's real hard to see what's going on.
A steep, hard-packed course with hairpin turns the surface consistency of soup make it very tough to hold onto the handlebars. Not to mention staying on your seat.
But this is a blast. This is such an adrenaline rush. I can't even believe it. I can't even describe it. It's a blast.
In other words, to say that speeding down a 3.5-mile course full tilt in under 5 minutes is the quintessential extreme challenge is a rude understatement. This is one sport where the timid need not apply. But of all the young Turks that have hit the downhill scene over the last year, one rider, world champion Dave Cullinan, stands out as one with more cool, nerve, and just plain guts than any other rider.
Started out winning the first time I ever raced. I won my first mountain bike race. I won the world championships in the dual slalom my second race. My margins for winning this year were more than like anybody else has really ever won the downhill classes by, winning the worlds by 5 seconds when second place through 10th place was 5 seconds there, so I beat the guy who got 10th by 10 seconds.
Never before has someone made such an immediate impact on the downhill circuit. Dave's competitive fire is reflected in his no-nonsense approach to winning.
If I think I'm beatable, then I might get beat, but if I think I'm unstoppable, then I'm going to try my best, and hopefully the results are going to come out like I planned them to. I don't like to think I'm beatable.
Confidence is obviously one of Dave's strong suits, but knowing just how far you can push the envelope on these treacherous courses is also critical to coming out on top.
What I try to go is just right to that fine line. It's a very fine line between riding over your head and riding the best of your abilities. And I think that is probably the thing I've been able to capture more than some of my competitors is they tend to ride over their head, and that leads to sliding out in a turn, losing time here where you got to know what your limits are. And as long as I ride at my limits, I'm not scared. And that's That's the whole key, I think, to winning, is knowing how fast to go, because each rider, has their limits.
Dave's legend grew tenfold last season by winning the first ever Reebok Eliminator. This dual rider format race, broadcast on ESPN, matched riders head-to-head over Mammoth Mountain's chilling kamikaze course. Dave's ability to improvise was the secret to his success.
It was a totally different race, I would say, from my point of view, than what any of us thought. We thought the Reebok Eliminator was going to be more or less, I'm going to draft so-and-so, and it's going to be a sprint down to the finish. But what we found out is, at 50 miles an hour, those rocks feel like bullets. And there wasn't too much drafting going on. My strategy going into the race was, to follow the other guy down and pass him at the finish, but it all kind of changed. I mean, the top half of the mountain was kind of a fun ride. You're looking at the competitor, you're talking, and you get down to the bottom, it's time to shut up and start pedaling a little harder and going a little faster and taking the turns at full speed, and then it comes out to a sprint at the finish. I thought that race was one of the best, most funnest races I've ever did in my life.
Dave didn't stop there. His antics at the World Championships only added to his reputation as one of the all-time crowd pleasers.
People were talking about the bridge at the World Championships. It was a 30-foot bridge that ran underneath the chairlifts. I was looking at it, and I was going, man, that'd be kind of cool to jump the whole thing. And people thought I was crazy, like, there's no way you can jump the whole thing. With chairlifts running, every 40 foot, there's a chair that runs 6 feet off the top where you have to time it, jumping in between the chairs, and then try to clear the whole thing, and then turn in the air. People heard I was doing it, but no one thought I would do it during the race. They thought it'd be absolutely stupid to do it. I just come flying over the thing sideways, and the crowd was so stunned they didn't even cheer. They were just like silent. I turned around, riding past them, looking back, just going, what, you guys didn't like that?
Pushing that envelope of adventure seems to be one of Dave's trademarks. And for the sport of mountain biking, a full-fledged, in-your-face personality has begun to build a real following.
I consider myself an extremist, a showman, and I consider myself, someone that wants to provide what the people want to see. They don't want to see someone flying down the road at 50 miles an hour on the ground when they can see the guy flying sideways through the air at 50, You got to bring in that extra excitement. That's what keeps them coming back.
Lynn Hill is a rock climber. As such, she has devoted tremendous amounts of time and energy, transcending more traditional occupations in favor of perfecting her sport both on a competitive and a personal level. And while the rewards and accolades have been plentiful for Lynn Hill, the competitor, a deeper, more traditional purpose fuels her personal drive for perfection.
It's almost like an expression of your childhood, that sort of sense of play, because it's really engaging and challenging, and it feels good. You feel an immediate sense of satisfaction. And I think in our society where people go to jobs and you're indoors all the time and you're maybe not so aware of your contribution to your job or society, you go out climbing and you're having fun with your friends, and you know that when you get to the top, you've put out a certain amount of effort and you've overcome some obstacles, and you really feel a sense of achievement.
In the 17 years that Lynn Hill has been climbing, perhaps no aspect of the sport has evolved quicker than its continuously expanding definition of achievement.
I started climbing when I was 14 years old with my older brother and sister. And then we just went out to places like Joshua Tree in Southern California to recreate in the outdoors, and we didn't really care too much about how hard the climbs were that we did.
Today, however, for top competitors like Lynn, achievement is associated with difficulty. And in the sport of world-class climbing, everything revolves around difficulty.
This form of rock climbing is highly specialized. Again, it evolved out of a form of training for the mountains, and then it got more and more specialized towards an athletic type of activity. So whereas before we might have just chosen the most obvious route up a giant formation, now we're choosing routes that are dramatically overhanging with as few features as possible, and that's what creates the challenge. And so it becomes almost like a gymnastic routine or a form of dance where every movement is very precise. It takes coordination, sense of timing, concentration, and obviously a lot of finger strength.
As the routes become more and more difficult, so too do the risks. But challenges have always been the cornerstone of Lynn's career. From her 4 Survival of the Fittest championships to last year's successful undertaking of a top-rated 514 climb.
When I first started climbing, most of the routes were a little bit more dangerous. There was more of an emphasis on the sense of adventure. So I learned a way of concentrating on what's important. If you're thinking about the fear, then you really can't concentrate on what's necessary to do in order to get yourself out of that situation. So as soon as you recognize that you're starting to think about fear, that's when you have to override your thinking and concentrate, regroup, and focus on the next move that you have to make.
Perhaps the most important move Lynn made, though, was taking her skills to Europe in 1986. It was there that she was introduced to competitive climbing.
People weren't too sure how they wanted, or whether they wanted to compete in rock climbing, because it seemed contrary to the philosophy of climbing, which is done in the outdoors. There's no coaches or rules or anything like that. But people wanted to push themselves in this area of difficulty, and climbing competitions seemed to be a logical extension of that trend. So it didn't take long before even the top climbers who boycotted this idea originally joined in the competitions. Now the competitions are held on artificial climbing walls specifically designed to have competitions and test difficulty. They're choreographed by world-class climbers, and it's a perfect medium for this type of climbing because you can calculate the level of difficulty of the climbs, and you're sure that nobody's been able to practice on these routes because they're man-made.
Today, Lynn Hill is recognized as one of the finest female climbers in the world. And while her many World Cup championships speak for themselves, she continues to strive for bigger and better things, including a stronger role for women in the sport.
I have a feeling that in climbing, there are certain kinds of routes that will ultimately favor women because we're smaller, we weigh less, and we have a certain kind of muscular endurance that can be developed that may actually be even better for women, ultimately. But we need to, as women, we need to accept that we are capable of that, and that's what climbing's about, is believing in the fact that you could do it.
My name's Dr. Lawrence Blair. My subject is psychoanthropology, and I've been working in the field in tribal psychoanthropology in Southeast Asia since 1972. My brothers and my work, the intention was to go out there, as we did in the early 70s, and to track down and live with tribal peoples, to keep a record of their world as they view it, before it's forever lost to human memory. It was a book by this famous naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, that really turned us onto that part of the world. He was a contemporary of Charles Darwin. And this character had spent 8 years traveling alone in Indonesia, catalogued 25,000 species of creatures, insects, plants, birds, many of which had never been seen by science. And his greatest voyage was with a tribe of seafaring peoples called the Bugis, who give the word boogeyman or bogeyman to the English language because they were the terror, the scourge of the Western spice traders out there in the 17th century. And they still sail these magnificent two-masted, 120-ton black-sailed schooners. So we set out in '72 to try and board a Bugis prow and sail with 16 Bugis, which we succeeded in doing through what turned out to be 3,000 miles of storms and doldrums and becalmings and various sorts of dangers before reaching the Aru Islands, which is the sole habitat of the greater bird of paradise.
The journey certainly had its share of tumultuous moments, but perhaps none posed as great a threat as the Bugis themselves.
We weren't all that sure we were walking out of the Bugis pirate trip, because we were 16 other people who do lend their name in a way to the annals of perfidy of, I mean, they're pirate peoples, there's no question about it. And even after months and months of sailing with them and virtually getting wrecked with them and sharing the last of our food with them, I felt that there was not really any honor amongst thieves.
After months of sailing, the expedition finally reached the Aru Islands, and as promised, the golden-tailed bird of paradise awaited. The cornerstone of the Blairs' visit to Indonesia, which would later be documented in a series of programs entitled The Ring of Fire, the spectacular and symbolic bird would prove to be one of the safer encounters of the journey. The island of Komodo would prove a greater challenge for the Blairs as they stalked the elusive dragon of the same name.
You had to go in there, and you were lucky if you would see one. You had to watch for circling carrion birds, and then you would go in that direction. With a bit of luck, they were circling a kill that was being eaten by these creatures called Komodo dragons. It was thought that these things only ran around in the daytime, that they were, well, they're cold-blooded, of course, and like a lot of lizards, they're only solar-powered. But these have got so much bulk, they're 11 feet long, they can weigh up to 400 pounds, that they can hunt very effectively at night as well. And so you have to be on your toes. Part of its ecology is that it has a poisonous bacteria in its mouth, so it only has to nick you, even if it doesn't get you, and bring you down and kill you. If you've been scratched by this, quite quickly you will fester and stink, guiding other dragons to you to finish you off. We spent a lot of time in Komodo over the years trying to film these well, up to 11-foot long carnivorous lizards which bring down deer, goats, wild boar, even feral horses and man if they possibly can. And but that's a situation where you're not really frightened, you're cautious, and at times you're just anxious. But the moments of sudden, absolute, heart-stopping terror, I would say, usually come on the roads of Southeast Asia, rather than in the jungles or at the sea.
And while this may be true, most people would rather take their chances on known busy roads than actively pursue unknown trails which lead to villages of practicing headhunters.
The headhunters, again, of New Guinea, they're from a village that the local missionaries said, look, don't go anywhere near, those guys are really rough. And nobody's been able to live in there for more than one night. So when we turned up there in these canoes, we felt a little bit worried by the whole thing. And they were pretty standoffish and brusque. And as soon as we got out of the canoe there, we took all our clothes off. And there was a moment of silence and then howls of laughter. And they removed what few clothes they'd put on for our benefit, you know, T-shirts where pants should be pants on their heads and this sort of thing. So we lived with them naked for the next 6 weeks or so. They only kill and eat members of neighboring clans and villages who've killed or eaten one of their clan or village. And once that's happened, there's been a war and there are some deaths, well then there's about a 6-month period of building these extraordinary beast poles, and they're anointed every day with human blood, and the promise that the souls of the unavenged ancestors will be avenged. And until they are avenged, these beast poles stand in the village. And once they're avenged, the spirits are no longer in those poles, they've been released, and the poles are cast down into the swamp.
A magnificent journey to Southeast Asia to document on film the incredible bird of paradise became a 15-year adventure for Lawrence Blair, in which he discovered an even greater paradise, the island chain of Indonesia. In the end, however, the adventure was bittersweet, as the painstaking realities of an ever-encroaching civilization came to light.
You know, most of the history of the white man's so-called conquest and discovery of other parts of the world has been imposing our views on them. There aren't that many more years left to try and redress the balance and go in entirely as their guests and try and capture a view of the world as they see it.
You armchair extremists who want to get reactive, go interactive and come surf the net with us. Check out our website at theextremist.com.